Right, okay. So welcome. Welcome back to the Philosophy Club here in Betete. And we're going to be looking today at a new field. We've kind of finished with the Christianities, although, you know, there's a lot, and one could go on and on with that and do a whole degree in it. And many people do, and they never look outside that box, or those boxes, but this is a whistle-stop tour. We have to think of this as a tour for visiting aliens from other planetary systems who are visiting Earth and want a quick overview of the world's spiritual history up to date. You know, I say that tongue-in-cheek, but kind of that's why we're going to be moving on this week. And we're looking from here at the next few weeks. We're going to be looking at what's called new religious movements. Now, in the technical study of religious studies, this is a whole fascinating field, and unless you're a specialist in religious studies, you don't even hear it exists often. I'm going to be drawing on a very useful guide or encyclopedia written by the University of Oxford Press called New Religions, a Guide, subtitle New Religious Movements, Sects and Alternative Spiritualities. Edited by Christopher Partridge. Came out a few years ago, but it's still very, very, very interesting. It's got a whole load of details which I've drawn on when I was drawing up my world religious and philosophical traditions periodic table. The colour of the new religious movements, I chose grey, because they're kind of neither black nor white, they're sort of in-betweenish. There are many shades of grey. And it covers a huge field, actually. So what is a new religious movement? How do we define it? Okay, it's a new religion, effectively, or it could be a new branch of an old religion that is sufficiently distinct as to qualify to be a new religious movement. So we're going to come to box 99, which is Japanese and Chinese new religious movements at some point soon. And a lot of them are breakaways from old Shinto or Taoist schools. They incorporate a lot of the old Shinto and Taoist teachings, but they include lots of new stuff like science, Western ideas, spiritualism, you know, a potpourri of new influences. So they qualify as a new religious movement. And in fact, Japan is teeming with them. I'd say most Japanese current population actually subscribe to one of these new religious movements because they're well organised. They have a little temple, a centre, a membership structure, and normally a kind of resident teacher of some kind, who's usually some kind of inspired, charismatic person that's in touch with the will of the gods. These new religious movements, they normally have someone who's like a spiritual authority at the heart. And we're going to go through and we're going to see. And that's true in the Americas, it's true in Africa, it's true in Europe, and in Asia and India too. So anyway, as a field, I mean, some people just specialise in new religious movements, and it's a big field. You know, you can do a PhD in it, or dozens of them. And I'll be drawing on the specialisms of people that I've studied who've worked in these fields. Okay, and one of the most interesting things about these new religious movements is that it proves in a sense that religion isn't a dying thing. It's not a sort of thing in the past. It's a moving feast that's continually evolving. One of their thought experiments I like to do with my students is if you came back in 500 years from now, reincarnated, and you did a course in religious studies, would the periodic table look the same? I mean, if we went back in time, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, the table would be different. There'd be no Islam, there'd be no Christianity, there'd be no, Sikhism and so on. So it is time sensitive. And if we come in the future, I mean, for all we know, one of these new religious movements might have taken off and become the world dominant religion by then. Or there might be one that hasn't been founded yet, which might be founded by someone listening to this talk, or in 100 years or something. In other words, I think human creativity, which manifests in the arts, music, dance, poetry, also manifests in philosophy and religious studies. So you know, there may well be significant changes to the periodic table over time that I can't predict. Although I can have a bash at thinking them through as a rational philosopher, I can adopt the hat of the futurist. I think I mentioned last time that there's such a thing as religious futurism, which looks at the futures of religions. My only prayer is that the existing ones shouldn't fight each other to the death. That's as my purpose in all this is as a peace studies expert, and I created the map of periodic table so that these religions know about each other. I believe ignorance is the cause of fear and warfare, and you know, in the very earliest times, if you didn't know about the tribe across in the next valley, you would attack them because they were strangers. Well, it's the same thing, you know, tragically, Putin is attacking the Ukrainian people because he doesn't understand them. He's ignorant about Ukrainian claims to sovereignty, Ukrainian cultural autonomy, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, its history and why they see themselves as separate. He's totally ignorant about Ukrainian Catholicism. And indeed, Ukraine is a flourishing haven of many new religions even. He's ignorant of them all, and his strategy when confronted with ignorance is just blow it up. So he's firing missiles. 60% of Kiev tonight is without water, and 40% is without electricity. You know, that's an absolutely catastrophic situation going on. So my work is premised on increasing interreligious understanding, so that these countries don't bomb each other to smithereens. Okay, having said that, now let's dive in and look at the first of the new religious movements we're going to look at, which is box number 92. These aren't in chronological order, they're kind of in some kind of conceptual order. Box number 92 is the tradition associated with Gurdjieff. Now Gurdjieff is a fascinating figure. I've listed there's about 50,000, probably 50,000 people nowadays on the planet that are following Gurdjieff's work with close attention, studying it, teaching it, you know, etc., practicing it. Possibly there have been up to 500,000 who have in the whole of history. It's a new religion. Gurdjieff lived in largely in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His dates are 1865 to 1949. And he was a mixture. He was half Armenian and half Greek. His father was Armenian. His father was Greek and his mother Armenian. And he lived in the Caucasus region where he was born, when it was then part of the Russian Empire. So he grew up with the Russian Empire, which had taken the Caucasus under its wing, so to speak, after a series of military conquests. And he was of a intellectually precocious bent. There are several very good biographies of him. And he was a spiritual seeker from quite early on. There's a very good book called Meetings with Remarkable Men about his early life. He was born into the Orthodox Church. His mother Armenian, his father Greek. They had him baptized as a Greek Orthodox Christian, which is obviously one of the boxes there. But that, you know, he wasn't prepared to just be the kind of Christian that goes to church once a month and just listens to the Mass. He wanted to really know the truth. So he went wandering, according to the biography that was made into a film by Peter Brook, with some friends, and they went to the Sufi heartlands of Iran, Kurdistan. They met Yazidis, they met mystics who were having monasteries in remote mountains and stuff, and spent time learning there. Gurdjieff said that a lot of his teaching came from the Sufi tradition. And the Sufis claim to be in different schools of Sufism. One school claims it's the original religion of that part of the world, before Islam even, and before Christianity. And there are strong Zoroastrian traces in these Sufi orders that he may well have encountered. So I think we have to see that Gurdjieff was a synthesizer of Zoroastrian, Sufi, even some Buddhist ideas which were in Central Asia at that time, and esoteric Christian ideas. It wasn't that he didn't like Christianity, he loved it, but he wanted to know the real truth about Christianity. And he was interested in esoteric traditions. He had for instance, one of his theories was that maybe Judas was part of a plot organised by Jesus. You know, Judas plays a very important role in shopping Christ to the Romans and the temple guards and making the crucifixion come about. Well, according to Gurdjieff, he speculates that maybe Judas was like set up for this job by Christ. It was a sort of voluntary thing. Now that's quite shocking, because normally Christians hate Judas. He's the most evil man in the world kind of thing. What if it's true, though, that Jesus and Judas had a secret understanding? And there's recently been a Gnostic Gospel of Judas discovered, which seems to indicate that. It's quite interesting, just found in the last few decades and translated. I have a copy here. You know, I suspend judgment. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. I don't think anybody does. But it's an interesting speculation. And it's the sort of thing that Gurdjieff was quite good at doing. You know, in French we say a bouleversement des idées, a sort of overthrowing of traditional ideas. Anyway, he made his way eventually to St. Petersburg, which was the capital of Russia at the time, and a great haven for freethinkers, scientists, mystics, spiritual seekers, theosophists. St. Petersburg was a real, like a soup of ideas. It was during what's called the Silver Age, which was a very creative time in Russian intellectual history. It was a time of the arts. Diaghilev and great composers, Scriabin and great poets were all, you know, doing their thing as creative artists. And Gurdjieff sort of set up shop in the cafes of St. Petersburg, giving classes in Sufism and the mysteries and esoteric Christianity and all that, in Russian, which he spoke fluently. And he was quite an exotic character. People liked Gurdjieff, like, who's this guy from the Caucasus? He's been all over the Middle East. What an interesting chap. Yeah, we'll go to his classes. He also got interested in art, and one of the students he attracted who came along to his classes was a guy called Uspensky, who met him in 1914. Uspensky was another Russian genius. I mean, Russians, when they're clever, they're very clever. They kind of go all the way. I think, yeah, the French and the Russians both really respect intellectual work. And Uspensky was a mathematician, an esotericist, a speculator in cosmic thought. And he's part of this Gurdjieff circle. So Uspensky is, you know, maybe the St. John. If Gurdjieff was the Christ, then Uspensky's St. John, or one of the leading disciples, the St. Thomas or something. And their relationship wasn't always easy. It wasn't just, you know, like adulation. Gurdjieff didn't want that kind of adulation. He wanted people to think for themselves. And sometimes he would be quite rude to people just to make them go off and do their own thing for a few years. He wasn't an easy teacher. He wasn't, you know, the Gurdjieff teaching is not sort of all soft, cuddly, you know, koala bears and light. It's about also accepting the darkness of the world and learning courage how to confront it. Okay, so so what he did, you see, this is the trouble in being St. Petersburg in 1914, 15, 16 is you're right on the verge of the revolution, and people were getting very extremist in their politics. I mean, Russian society was divided between the aristocracy who supported the Tsar and the war effort, and the poor, the unemployed, the proletariat, who were absolutely starving to death and were being slaughtered in the trenches in a war they didn't understand and didn't really want. I mean, it's tragic. It's like history repeats itself, as Marx said. The second time round is farce. And the current war, when poor Russian soldiers are being sent to fight in Ukraine for a war they don't believe in and don't understand, it's like a rerun. Anyway, Gurdjieff although he had some sympathies for the working classes, and many of his students and friends were quite poor, it wasn't he was just teaching the aristocracy. He didn't agree with the Bolshevik ruthlessness behind their seizure of power. And under Lenin and Trotsky and a cadre, eventually Stalin became the key guy, they implemented absolutely ruthless new, almost like a new religious movement, Bolshevism. It was a pseudo-communism. They'd taken ideas from Marx that they wanted and disregarded the rest. And they instituted a ruthless pogrom against anyone that didn't agree with them. And within a few months of seizing power, which they did using violence, in November 1917, they instituted a reign of terror, so that under Lenin's direction, if you were opposing their seizure of power, you would be shot by the Cheka, the secret police that they set up. And out of that grew absolute horrors and nightmares, and eventually the archipelago that, instead of shooting them, they thought it'd be cheaper to stick them all in concentration camps and work them to death in Siberia. So right up until the 1950s, the Soviet regime under the Bolsheviks was working people to death in these camps, which we didn't really know about in the West until Solzhenitsyn exposed the whole thing, having been through them, and wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which was a real wake-up call to Western intellectuals who'd sort of given Russia the benefit of the doubt up to that point, thinking, they're good people, communists, they're on our side. Well, actually, they were pretty foul and fierce, and Gurdjieff saw this coming. So what he did, and it's quite an amazing story, is he got together a band of his students, and they escaped from St. Petersburg by train through the Civil War battlefields. They went to the Caucasus, and they reached a part of the Caucasus where it was alternating between the White Russians, who were the conservatives trying to kick the Bolsheviks out, and the Red Russians, who were the Bolsheviks. And several times during those few months, he was occasionally in a town that was under the Bolsheviks. Fortunately, he'd organised a pass, which was written by a top Bolshevik in Petersburg, that said, grant this man Gurdjieff freedom of travel, he's a scientist doing research in the Middle East, let him have a free pass, And so when the Bolsheviks were in charge, he produced this pass, and they didn't actually arrest him or kill him, because he could have been killed off. But when the White Russians were in charge, he then was able to tell them, look, actually, I'm escaping the Bolsheviks. I'm trying to cross the Caucasus Mountains, and I'm secretly on your side, but don't tell anyone. I'm not a warrior, so I'm decided to leave the country. And his goal was to get to Istanbul. He wanted just to get out of the chaos of Russia descending into civil war. And so the story is that he did. He found a steamer ship that was going from that part of the world in the Black Sea region, Georgia, up to Istanbul. And he and his students and friends, a party of them, they got to Istanbul. And he set up shop there. So he, of course, being a man who's familiar with the Middle East, he was happy in Istanbul. It's a very sophisticated culture. Intellectuals are respected. And he started teaching and running classes. And here, an interesting thing happened, because a guy in the British Embassy called J.G. Bennett, who was one of the intelligence chiefs attached to the British Embassy, because Britain had just defeated Germany in World War One, and the Turkish War had come to an end. The British Army had conquered Palestine with the help of the Arabs, and Istanbul was occupied actually by the Allies at this time. But it was all simmering away, and pretty soon there was going to break out a war between the Greeks and the Turks under Mustafa Kemal. They didn't accept the result of World War II. They'd been on the German side, but they refused to surrender, and they carried on fighting. So the British were kind of keeping their eye on the whole situation. and it's a fascinating story. What Gurdjieff was doing, and J.G. Bennett, who was a political intelligence officer at the embassy, they became friends. And J.G. Bennett actually went along and became a student of Gurdjieff. I mean, this is an old, I think he was in his mid to late 20s, a highly intelligent young British intellectual who realised Gurdjieff was quite something. What was the mystery of the teachings? And that inspired Bennett's lifelong respect for Gurdjieff. Bennett became a teacher in his own right when he went back to Britain. He set up a school called the Bishara Institute, which I gave some talks at one of its later incarnations. It's still going in Scotland, when I used to live there. And Bennett was a genius. He wrote a 4-volume treatise called The Dramatic Universe, which synthesized Gurdjieff's ideas with science and with the periodic table of the chemical elements. Because Gurdjieff had theories about matter and reality that were in advance of their time. And Bennett through Gurdjieff, became deeply interested in Sufism and spent time looking for the hidden kutub. In Sufism, there's a tradition that at any one time on the planet there's a hidden kutub, which means the pole. And the idea is that the Earth rotates around a pole, a sort of geometric line between the North and South Pole. And all the movement of the Earth each day is around that pole. But the pole itself is invisible. If you look inside the Earth, you won't find a big pole. It's just a sort of geometric concept, or a concept in physics. So in spirituality, all the great sages of the world, said Bennett and Gurdjieff, they kind of rotate around different teachers. Just as, say, Jesus had 12 disciples plus others, that we know the names of others. There were 70 disciples, in fact. And then they in turn taught others, and they taught others, and they taught others. So Jesus is the pole of Christianity, as it were, and the others revolve around that. Muhammad is the pole of Islam. So Muhammad had many disciples and students, followers, and in the 10, initially it was just Ali and his wife Khadija, two students, and then it grew, and then the more it was persecuted, the more it grew, and then Islam spread to 10 or a dozen or 20 or 30, and by the time of the Hijrah to Medina, it was a few hundred, and then other people came and joined, and now it's 1 billion people on the planet, but around those billion, Muhammad is the pole. He is the kutub. And the same with all the other traditions, Zoroastrianism and so on. What Bennett and Gurdjieff were saying is that who's the pole behind the pole behind the pole? Where is the hidden master that is the master of all of these sages? Is there one, and if so, who and where? And can I find him, please? And that's what Gurdjieff had set out to find as a young man. Was he ever put in touch with the pole, the kutub? Well, different followers of Gurdjieff said different things, and Gurdjieff himself was somewhat sly about that. If you asked him point blank, have you met the hidden master behind all the sages in the universe? He'd say, oh, go and make some cheese on toast. He didn't give away his wisdom easily, because he felt that it's up to the student to work for it. After you've made the cheese on toast, maybe go and chop some wood up. We'll have a fire, and then we might talk about it. So there was anyway. Next thing, Gurdjieff went to Paris. He ended up in France, and one of the books I'm writing is about why so many profound spiritual intellectuals have ended up as refugees in France. And Gurdjieff was one of them. I think it's because the French have this respect for thinking, for intellectual life, for spirit, for religion, but not in a fanatical way. So there's a freedom of thought here, which Gurdjieff respected. And he ended up buying a big chateau near Fontainebleau, outside Paris. A wealthy benefactor of his helped him buy the place, and he set it up as an institute for the study of mankind. The Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, which was set up in 1922. in Paris, well, in Fontainebleau. And here students came from all over the world because his ideas had become quite well known, teachings, he published some books. And Catherine Mansfield, the writer from New Zealand, came, musicians came, and some interesting intellectuals sort of came and visited him. And he wasn't just giving academic talks, he thought that spirituality requires a total transformation of our condition. Essentially, he taught that most of us are asleep. Most of us are, as it were, asleep. And we have this false self that we think is true, and we go around doing our job as a false self. His job was to wake us up. And that can be done partly by teaching, partly by reading, by study, partly by meditation and prayer, which he made his students do, but also by physical exercises like yoga. He devised a series of physical moves that students should do, and also dance. He's a believer in dance. I lived for a short time in a Gurdjieff community in London back in the 90s, called the October Gallery, which was great fun, great experience, and you still have to do these movements. So, yeah, and he carried on living there and teaching. He travelled to the States a few times, and if you're interested, read a good biography. And then he ended up dying in 1949. He survived the war under quite difficult conditions in Paris. And I think there's a lovely story about his death and his end, which shows the measure of the guy, really. Nobody really, he wasn't that famous, he wasn't like Jesus or Muhammad or anything. Nobody really heard of him. A few intellectuals, a few thousand intellectuals maybe. Just very deep people that had made their way to see him and studied with him. And then they'd gone off and set up their own thing. So Ouspensky was now teaching in London, running an amazing series of classes, inspired largely by his meeting with Gurdjieff. Ouspensky was more intellectual and a better, mathematician and stuff. So he made his stuff really, really complicated. Gurdjieff was a bit more approachable. Then J.G. Bennett was teaching in the Cotswolds. He'd set up a centre. And these people were serious heavyweights intellectually in their own right, and they in turn met other people that came into their circles. So the Gurdjieff work, as it's called, he never described what he's doing as setting up a new religion. No, I'm not setting up a new religion. Don't be bonkers. We've got too many of them. I'm just trying to get the work done, was what he would say. And what is the work? The work is waking people up to awareness from our slumber. And what causes Bolshevik mass torture and Stalinism and stuff? What causes Hitler, which arose as a reaction partly against Bolshevism, but like two devils dancing on the stage of Europe. It doesn't make one devil any better than the other. They're both pretty foul. How do we stop the dance of death that's going on in Europe? Was Gurdjieff's point. Well, we can only do it by wakening up the conscience. And he wrote a funny kind of sort of semi-novel type thing called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which circulated in manuscript during his lifetime, eventually was published after his death. And this is a sort of science fiction, humorous story about Beelzebub, the devil, doing a survey of Earth and pointing out the foibles of humanity to his grandson. Like human beings are asleep. Well, that's fine because we don't want them questioning too much. And it's full of science fiction type stuff. It's written slightly tongue in cheek. There's a strange race of humans on the moon, for instance, according to Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. I don't think Gurdjieff literally believed that. He's writing an allegory. It's a science fiction allegory. But it's very interesting. Bennett, as I say, wrote a 4-volume classic, The Dramatic Universe, which is more of a scientific, philosophical text. Gurdjieff didn't stick to the rules of philosophy. He wrote science fiction. Anyway, when he died, and the best overall survey to this whole movement is by a man called James Webb, who was a big influence on me, a British historian at Cambridge University. He wrote a book called The Harmonious Circle about Gurdjieff and his circle, which includes Bennett and Uspensky and many others. The Enneagram was an important part of this movement, and the Enneagram has separately become a thing in its own right, which is a nine-sided diagram, which indicates that there are 9 types of humans. The Enneagram has been used as a psychological tool, and now it's quite a big thing in many parts of the world. But it goes back to Gurdjieff's study of Sufism, essentially. And James Webb in his book The Harmonious Circle describes all this in detail, and he explains Gurdjieff's life story. And it's from him I got the following story. So when Gurdjieff died, somebody had to organise the funeral, his close friends, and they thought, well, we'll do it in the Orthodox Church in Paris, which I've not been in, but I've seen from the outside. It's near the Eiffel Tower, the Russian Orthodox Church. And they thought, a few people will turn up, so they sent the word out to their friends and relatives and stuff. And then the funeral happened, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came from all over Paris, every different walk of life. And they didn't know most of them, like very poor people, like tramp type people were coming in. And aristocrats and friends of the President of France and God knows what. They were all showing up to pay their respects, like thousands of them. And by talking and as they were chatting, over tea at the kind of wake afterwards, it turned out that Gurdjieff was known and loved by like half the poor of Paris, because he was constantly giving away presents and money. If he saw a beggar in the street, he'd give them something and get chatting. He was practicing what he called, the actual love, which is at the heart of Christianity. So he was known and respected secretly by half the poor of Paris, who, when he died, they all came to his funeral to pay respects. And he hadn't bragged about it. Nobody knew this side to his nature. It was secret. And I think that's taking Christ's teaching seriously, because Christ said, do good, but don't boast about it. Don't if anything, keep quiet about it, because otherwise the bad ones will come after you. Doing good in this world is a minority position, and it's usually a cause of jealousy and things, so you have to be kind of secretive about doing good. As Christ said, be as wise as a serpent, but innocent as a dove. So secretly go about doing good like a serpent, but just pretend you're a little dove if they come after you, the SS or the KGB or something, So anyway, that's Gurdjieff and his tradition. Yeah, fascinating stuff. And so it counts as a new religious movement. It's in the box, 92. Okay, let's move on and look at the next one. Let's look at Rajneesh, or as he's sometimes called, Osho. Now, he's another very interesting character. Probably better known, I think, than Gurdjieff. Certainly back in the 70s he was quite popular. And he was a maverick Indian who was born in Rajasthan and had Jain teachers. He was initially born into a Jain tradition, which is the central boxes in white, 88 to 89. And Jains are very clever. I mean, I've been to India many times and met them. They believe in absolute non-violence, and they're quite strict in their, they're all very strict vegetarians. They won't kill an animal. The priests among them and monks won't even breathe an insect, so they cover their mouths with pandemic protection.